Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this evening, and welcome to our public lecture. We have here today a speaker who probably doesn't need much of an introduction to many of you, but he's going to get one from me because otherwise I look like a total pillock standing here doing nothing. I actually have had to make notes because Zack is, well, such a prolific worker. So we have here Dr. Zack White, who is an award-winning historian, author, and the host of the Napoleonic Wars Podcast. Zack received his PhD from the University of Southampton with a thesis on crime and punishment in the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars. He was founder and inaugural editor-in-chief of the interdisciplinary research journal Romance, Revolution, Reform, was commissioning editor at History Hit, and edited a collection of Napoleonic research called The Sword and the Spirit for Hellion. He's also currently working on a book based on his PhD, tentatively titled, I believe, Plunder, Provost and Punishment. Halfway there. He's been the winner not once, but greedily twice of the Wellington Prize, awarded for work in the general area of Iberian studies or military or British political history. He is known to some as the Napoleonicist, the host of the hugely popular Napoleonic Wars podcast, which has reached literally hundreds of thousands of listeners worldwide. However, Zack is here today as the chair of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. Founded by Zack and others in 2021, the NRWGC is a new registered charity seeking to honour the memory of those of all nationalities who served between 1775 and 1815 by restoring veterans' graves and facilitating the burial of disinterred veterans' remains. And he is here to talk to us today on the topic Napoleonic Unknown Warriors, the War Dead, Memory, and the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. Over to Zack.
Thanks very much, Graham. Some people would call that precocious rather than hardworking, but I'll take the nicer version you offered there. Evening, folks. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and hello to folks who are joining us online. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a topic for which really there are no right answers, and I want to make that clear right from the outset. I'm going to pose some extremely awkward questions to us all tonight, and hopefully you will take the opportunity to share your views. Now, you will see the whole range of views on questions of war dead commemoration and where the line is between voyeurism and respect. Questions like, is a soldier dying in one conflict any more of a tragedy than if they die in another? Where does commemoration start and where does it stop? And is looking at the war dead in a museum voyeurism, or is it educational? As I say, there are no right or wrong answers, but more than anything else with the work of the NRWGC, I hope that we can start a conversation to try and achieve a consensus, or at least a move towards a consensus on this issue. The law on this is complex and grey. The ethics on this is equally complex and even greyer. And as you will see, there's going to be a lot of conflict between what we morally regard as being the right thing to do and what sometimes happens in practice. Before I start though, I do want to give you all a warning. This PowerPoint does contain images of human remains. That is done as discreetly as possible, but you need to be aware that it's a presentation about the war dead, and so the war dead will feature. I will give you a warning prior to showing any images of remains, so you can look away should you wish. That's a good start. There we go. Okay, so to start us off, I do like to do a little bit of audience participation when it comes to these sessions. I see people groaning already in the audience, but hey, we're going to go with it and see how badly this flops on its face. So by way of applause or cheers or boos or stamping of feet, but ideally not throwing things, if that's okay, please, because it will be messy to clear up afterwards. How do you react to the following? So applause, jeers, cheers, stamping of feet, whatever it might be. How do you react to the Battle of Waterloo? Okay, so for those of you who probably can't hear this because you're attending online, we had some hissing That was an interesting one. I wasn't expecting hissing. A couple of people sort of half-heartedly clapping, but nobody likes the lion's mound, which seems to be quite the consensus. Oh, we've got applause coming in from people. I didn't know that was a feature, but we've got applause coming in from the people attending on Zoom. So thank you for that. An astonishment from somebody. Okay. So having got you warmed up with that one, what about this guy? We've got a mix, the predictable boos and cheers, some thumbs up, all sorts of things, laughter. Okay, so we're getting the general idea. What about this guy? So what I knew there was a guy in the audience who I knew was coming tonight, and I knew he would boo when I put Wellington up, because he studied Wellington's politics, and so you've always got to factor that in. And last, but by no means least, what about this guy? Yes. Hopefully you've come here tonight knowing that Richard Sharp isn't real. If not, then I'm sorry, but we've got a long way to go in terms of your knowledge of the period. So straight away, you can see there's a complexity to how we think about the individuals from this period, how we remember this period. Even the events themselves have contested memory. But if we were to take a different conflict in a different time, with granted a very different scale of involvement, actually, perhaps the overarching reaction would be one of respect and reverence. And I am, of course, talking about the First and Second World Wars. From left to right on the screen, you have the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey. There are, of course, equivalents for other nations. The CWGC cemeteries, which around the world are the poster boy, if you will, of commemoration and respect for our war dead. And of course, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is by no means unique as a national organisation that seeks to remember the sacrifice of the fallen. In the centre, you have the Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, i.e. an American equivalent. And on the right, you have the Notre Dame de Lorette in France. All of these clearly have a common premise, which is to focus on sacrifice in post-1914 conflicts. What that means is that we can sit here in 2023 confident in the knowledge that the remains of our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers receive a basic dignity of a place, a marked place in the earth. But what about their grandfathers and great-grandfathers? What happens to their remains? Well, we have some very obviously high-profile cases, and there is a question I want us to consider right from the outset, which is what might be wrong with what you're about to see. So hopefully some of these will be familiar. Let's see. I mean, any takers on this one? Hopefully people know who that might be. Heckle me. It's always a really bad idea to suggest that the audience heckles you, but we're going to go with it. Oh, that was a controversial gauntlet thrown down there. The founder of modern Europe, said somebody. So this is quite obviously Napoleon's tomb in the Hôtel d'Invalides in Paris. Now this one, the clue's kind of in the photo, actually. Admittedly not the best thought through of these. That is the tomb of...
Norfolk egotist.
Some Norfolk guy, an egotist. I knew it was a bad idea to involve the audience. I don't know why I went with that. So that is Nelson's tomb in Westminster Abbey. And anybody know who that is? Well, I know some of the people know who that is because I'm looking at them kind of hoping that they might want to make a comment. Apparently not. Yes, it's the Gordon Memorial. Absolutely right. So this is the Gordon Memorial in Waterloo. It's on the Waterloo battlefield. So what's potentially wrong with that? And equally, if you're in the chat and you want to post, then feel free. Not that I can actually see what's in the chat, but we've got a take at the back. Yep, please. They're glorifying each individuals.
And it's just the one person they are representing.
It's an isolated individual, absolutely. And what about social status? They're all quite posh, pretty much cuts to the heart of it. So those are the upper echelons of society. The people who can afford it get the commemoration. They get the permanent markers. But what if I were to say about these people? Who is remembered here? Some of these people are actually quite high profile. If you've looked at the flyer, you'll actually know who that person is. People are now desperately reaching for the flyers that we brought with us to this event. So on the left, you have the grave of Severus Stretton. Stretton was a regular officer, so not somebody who climbed right to the top of the military hierarchy. He has what was once an incredibly impressive grave in Southampton Old Cemetery. Today, it is not impressive. Stretton's record includes the service record, that is, includes the Battle of Vittoria, where he was wounded not once, but twice, carrying a musket ball in him to the day that he died. So that 9 feet, not 6 feet, everyone thinks it's 6 feet, it's never 6 feet, it's 9 feet. 9 feet below that dilapidated monument lies a piece of French lead, a poignant reminder of the service records, the sacrifice, and the ongoing pain that was caused by people's contributions to the Napoleonic Wars. In the middle is one of the most high-profile individuals to not have a well-known grave. That is the grave of William Carr Beresford, the person who commanded the Portuguese army for much of the Peninsular War and beyond, in fact. He is buried in Kilndown in Kent. His grave once had a far more impressive kind of roof structure over the top of it, but in the early 1900s that was collapsing, so they took that away. And what we have now found, having assessed this as a charity, is that the mortar around these steps is crumbling. Water is now getting in, it's turning into ice, it's expanding, and effectively it is breaking apart Beresford's tomb from the inside out. On the far right is quite an unusual grave. This is the grave of a French prisoner of war. Pierre Garnier was a lieutenant in the 66th Regiment. He was captured when the British took Waterloo in 1810, I believe, but then subsequently died when he had, having given his parole, when he was in a place called New Alresford in Hampshire. In a few weeks' time, that grave will look new because the NRWGC is paying for major work to be done to clean the grave, to restore the lettering, so that people can better remember the experience of Garnier and others like him. So there you have 3 examples of varying levels of society. Now, straight away, you'll notice that what's missing there is, of course, the rank and file. There are comparatively few instances of rank and file graves. In fact, I opened with one on the very first slide. There you go, Brian Dugalding. This was an individual who was buried in Brompton Cemetery because he was a Chelsea pensioner. So he's actually buried in the Chelsea pensioners plot in Brompton Cemetery. But when a major study was done of a number of, by no means all of, but a number of the Napoleonic War graves, Dugalding got missed. People have forgotten his service record, forgotten his sacrifice. And I stumbled across his grave completely by chance. I was looking for someone else, peered at that, and made out the words, which you might just be able to see there, Waterloo, which tells you everything you need to know. A Waterloo veteran, a recipient of the Waterloo Medal, obviously very severely eroded because of the nature of the stone, but we think he probably also fought at Salamanca. We know that he was at Neve and Nivelle. You can read that from the tombstone. And so we're now trying to piece together his service history. We are effectively trying to reconstruct what happened in his life in retrospect, starting at the end point and then trying to work backwards. So why am I showing you all of this? Why am I making this admittedly slightly laboured point of different people's experiences and what we choose and don't choose to remember? One of the most significant developments in historical study within the last half a century has been a shift away from the grand narrative of history. We no longer focus exclusively on the big campaigns. We no longer focus on the generals like Wellington and Napoleon. Yes, there are still works out there, and yes, brilliant work is being done that furthers our understanding of those individuals and offers more nuanced perspectives. But the single biggest development in the way in which we approach history as a whole, but particularly within military history, has been a shift towards the ordinary people, the folks like you and me, the people who didn't have the titles and the financial backing to buy their way up through the ranks of the army, who didn't have political leverage and patronage to be able to exert influence and climb their way up to the top. The ordinary folks in society have been the ones that have taken the main kind of focus of our interest in the last half a century. You can see this with things like memoirs, the particular focus in recent times on the individual experience. That is now deeply embedded. It's integral to how we approach historical study today. But seemingly it's not integral to how we remember. Because if you were to go right here, right now, and consider where you would go to remember a soldier of this conflict, you'd probably be hard pushed to pinpoint an appropriate location. And as you'll see in due course, that is one of the things that the NRWGC seeks to address through grave restoration. So perhaps how we commemorate needs to catch up. And here's an indication of why, and one of the sort of contradictions. So a warning, this next slide does contain an image of human remains. If you don't want to see that for understandable reasons, please look away now. This is the body of a soldier who was found when the museum on the battlefield of Waterloo was being created. In order to not change the profile of the battlefield, they decided to build that museum underground. That obviously meant a major excavation operation, and in the process, they uncovered this guy. This was the first individual to be found on the battlefield of Waterloo ever, apart from the fact that the war graves have been plundered, but I'm going to get to that in due course. So this was a major discovery. The museum carried out a whole host of research. They produced a very interesting booklet on the guy, his experiences, and what his bones can tell us about the ordinary individual's experience of conflict, of the lifelong campaign, and a heck of a lot more besides. Gareth Glover subsequently pointed to the potential to identify this individual's name, a claim which has since been contested by the museum in question, who aren't confident that you can be as certain as Gareth is on this. They then had to face a knotty little question. What do you do with this guy? You've done the research, you found out everything you possibly can about him. Now what? Because what you have presented with you is a body. What do you do with that body? And they came up with this reasoning on the right-hand side. The questioning relating to his presence in terms of the memorial being the museum, has been the subject of much discussion within the team responsible for its design, as well as between the various researchers who have been studying him in such detail. Ultimately, it seems to everybody that the greatest homage that could be paid to him was to consider him with the respect to which he is entitled, and that the museum exhibit has sought to ensure, as the anonymous and silent representative of the dozens of thousands of men who perished that day in the same tragic circumstances. Now that is one stance amongst many on what you can do and what you perhaps should do with veterans' bodies. There are a whole host of complex issues around this. One thing to consider is what would happen if you did this for somebody who died in the First World War. Well, I can tell you that right here, right now. You would have a scandal, probably on a scale of Partygate, that would see the left and the right call into question the appropriateness of the political left and right, call into question the appropriateness of that decision. We wouldn't do it for 1914 to 1918 or for 1939 to 45. So why do we do it for this period? Now, to be clear, I respect their decision. This, as you can see here, these are a group of highly experienced, deeply professional individuals who have sat down and wrestled with that ethical dilemma themselves. I might not agree with their decision, but I respect that their view is one in a continuum. And I think that is a really important thing to emphasize, that whilst as an organization, the NRWGC has a very clear preference. We call ourselves a war graves charity. One of our aims is to inter veterans when they are disturbed. But that doesn't mean that we turn around and go, this is disgraceful and it's unacceptable, because it's not. It's not the case that that's not right. We just have the stance that perhaps there's a better way of doing this. Now, in terms of the wider discussion, it's important to recognize that, as I said at the start, there isn't a consensus on this. And you can point to that in any number of surveys that have been done. So in 2009, Historic England hired a separate organisation, a polling organisation, to contact 1,000 people and see what their views were on the display of human remains. Not veterans specifically, just human remains as a whole. 52% agreed with displaying bones regardless of age. Only 9% had a problem with it. The others kind of said, well, age of remains matters. 100 years is often one of the big cut-offs. We'll talk about the legal implications of that in just a moment. The Lonely Planet in 2019 emphasizes the potential for skeletons to be entertainment. You know, the fact that you've got a museum full of skeletons makes the battlefield of Bosworth more entertaining in the view of the people producing the book that year. In 2018, Leeds Museums and Galleries ran a survey because they were doing an exhibition on exactly this, people's bodies across history. 64% thought the public should be allowed to photograph human remains. At the time of conducting that survey, Leeds Museum themselves acknowledged that there was a problem with the methodology in that they were surveying people who came to the exhibition. If you're going to an exhibition about human remains, quite obviously you don't have a problem seeing human remains, and that's kind of fundamental. You get what it says on the tin, right? But then you've got this interesting comment from Professor Tony Pollard, who of course is one of the prominent, preeminent even, conflict archaeologists at Glasgow University. He works with Waterloo Uncovered, the charity that very recently was responsible for the discovery of only the second individual to be dug up, the second soldier to be dug up on the battlefield of Waterloo. And this was his reaction to the Memorial 1815 situation. And this actually hit the headlines when he said this. His remark was, and I'm quoting here directly, "He was a soldier, he died in battle, he deserves a grave, end of." Pretty emphatic, and that was picked up by the national newspapers and went slightly ballistic. So have things changed? I conducted a deeply unscientific survey on Twitter of all places, because nobody's ever known Twitter to, you know, be the product of an echo chamber or anything like that. I'm not going to read out all of these responses, but these are some of, not all of, the responses that I've received, and they cover the whole range from, yes, it's absolutely fine, we shouldn't even be having this debate, through to, if somebody dies in conflict, they need to be given a modicum of respect, and so therefore should not be put on display, through to, why are we discussing veterans within this context? Actually, shouldn't the question be, should we put humans on display? And this is that's an entirely valid and very important point. You know, where does that boundary lie? Nobody knows. Yes, the NRWGC, as an organisation that is focused on conflict, makes a particular point about veterans' bodies. But actually, that point of where does this stop? If you're going to make an exception for those who die from post-1914, why aren't you applying that exception to those who died pre-1914? Now, if you're going to apply that exception to people who die in conflicts, why are you making a distinction between those who died in conflict and those who just died? Where is that boundary? One of the big things to come out of this survey was this question about purpose. Why are you putting those remains on display? Is it for impact, or is there an educational benefit? Even then, people turn around and they point to a grey area, which is that these days 3D printing has come on so fast that you could make an incredibly convincing replica of a set of remains, put them on display, achieve the same educational impact, and yet also bury the individual, giving them the dignity of the burial, giving a place for people to visit, having seen the replica of the remains, to then continue that journey onwards to stop and pay further respect to their life. And the upshot of the vote proves absolutely nothing, because about 200 people took part, and this is just a poll of the people who tuned into Twitter who happened to follow me on that particular day. It's meaningless, but there you have it. Those are the results of that particular poll. Now let's start dealing with some of the deeper questions behind this, and particularly questions of ethics and law. What does the law actually say? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that you cannot own a body. So any museum actually holds those remains because they have a duty of care as custodians of them. What we're effectively doing is classifying bodies as artifacts. Now that in turn raises the question, at what point does a set of remains stop being a body and start becoming an artifact? Again, nobody has the answer. In terms of the law, there was a case, it was R.V. Kelly in, I believe, 1998. I won't go into the details, otherwise we'll be here all night. But if you do want to read up on this, Charlotte Woodhead wrote a chapter on this care, custody and display of human remains, which goes into a lot of these points in brilliant detail. Basically, the rule is, if remains are under 100 years old, you must consult the family, and if possible, you must have the consent of the individual. And increasingly, consent of the individual has become the key thing. Now, for individuals who died well before these legal rulings came into effect, getting the consent of the individual is quite obviously problematic. This 100-year rule also applies to display of human remains. So what you have is a situation where if a set of remains is 100 years or younger, then consent is required, and you need to think incredibly carefully about the benefit that is being gained from that. There is a really important point here that displays must not offend public decency. They must not be gratuitous. In other words, the voyeurism needs to be weeded out. There needs to be a point to what you are doing. You shouldn't just be putting these individuals on display for the shock factor. Now, that's great, but what about remains that are older than 100 years? Well, between 100 and 500 years, there is a really weird grey area where nobody actually knows. It's just opinion. If they're 500 years and older, the consensus is do what the hell you like, which is why we have a situation where nobody turns around and objects to mummies. But again, we come back to this point. If we're going to make an exception for those who died during the Napoleonic Wars, should we not also be reconsidering the situation with mummies? In fact, what we found as an organization is that we have some people who died from this conflict. And in fact, the person who discovered all of this is in the room tonight. So thank you for that. But we have individuals who have been buried, and then the nature of the environment that they're buried in has led to a mummification process. And so those individuals are on display in a museum in Italy as examples of mummies from a modern era. The next thing to talk about is deaccessioning. Now, we as an organization are built up of many different perspectives. We have archaeologists, we have historians, and we also have museum curators on our board. So I must emphasize that when a museum deaccessions, it is not the same as getting rid of. And the reason I must emphasize that is because my curator trustee would beat me over the head repeatedly if I didn't make that distinction very clear. There is a point that when you take on a set of human remains, you are effectively doing something that is true of all objects in museums. You are doing a piece of collection management. You have to catalogue the remains. You have to decide what you're going to do with them, whether the time is right, whether there will be an exhibition in the passage of time where that particular artifact, in this case a body, will be appropriate. And deaccessioning is a natural part of that process. So there are occasions when museums will decide that actually holding anything might not be in the public interest, or it might be better served if it's in another collection, and so they move the remains. So they move the item. That therefore means that there is precedent for this, and we have seen this quite a lot, the accessioning, in relation to the remains of indigenous communities. This has been particularly high profile, as you can imagine, of late, and effectively what we have seen is a great inclination for museums to turn around and say, actually, we should return these remains to their indigenous community, and then the indigenous community will make a decision on how they proceed from there. But even then, there are problems. In 2004, the Human Tissues Act came in, and what that basically said is that you have got to be incredibly careful if those remains are under 1,000 years. The trouble is, you then have a conflicting piece of guidance, the guidance for the care of human remains in museums, 2005. And what this basically stipulates is that whilst there is an obligation for consultation, there is not an obligation for return or deaccessioning if the museum does not deem it to be appropriate. In practice, what this means is that if you are making an application to have remains around 300 years old, deaccessioned, you are unlikely to get an answer in favour. If you put an application in for remains that are 500 years plus, it is generally accepted that you will not even be considered. You will, in effect, be told, thanks for your email, our answer is no. Now, again, we come back to these complex issues. Where does the boundary lie? And this is a problem that is not going anywhere. I'm going to flick back now to Napoleonic Examples. These are a series of headlines, all from within the last 4 years, that relate to individuals who have been found. The NRWGC, as you can imagine, has been tracking this. We have in excess of 100 disinterred individuals who we are monitoring because we know that they were dug up very recently, and we're trying to work with local partners to find a positive resolution to what happens to them next. I'll give you an example. So on the top left, the mass grave in Viana that was discovered in 2019 found 84 soldiers. They're broadly speaking thought to be British. They've tested, I believe it was 6 of them. They haven't tested all of them comprehensively because that's a hugely expensive process that will cost them something in the region of £250,000 to complete. We are having conversations with the authorities out in Viana as an organisation. We've had the conversation about display of human remains. The current consensus with the local politicians and authorities seems to be that Viana is not inclined to display those remains, but there remains an ongoing question about the legal status of those remains as artefacts and whether or not it is appropriate for the local archaeological institute, which holds those remains, to release those remains for burial. You also have the case, and this is a really interesting counterpoint, of Charles-Etienne Boudin, who was found underneath a nightclub floor in Smolensk. His remains were returned. There wasn't a debate about that. They just got flown back to Paris, and they were buried in the Hotel d'Anville, not very far from Napoleon. Bottom left, this is the second most recent discovery. I mentioned Waterloo uncovered earlier, and Tony Pollard, his team, found a soldier at Mont Saint-Jean who is thought to have been effectively put in a ditch that was used to dispose of human remains, including amputated limbs. There was also a dead horse that was found in that ditch, and they found a soldier. That was a hugely significant discovery, only the second time that a soldier was found on the Waterloo battlefield. But then we had the news that broke just earlier this year. Sitting in somebody's attic for, we're not entirely sure quite how long, has been a sack of remains of soldiers who fought at Plancenoit on the sort of bottom right corner of the Waterloo battlefield. What had basically happened here is that somebody had had some extension work done, and they had discovered these remains, and clearly nobody decided to call the authorities, which is obviously legally what you have to do if you find human remains. But that does end up being quite a complex process. So they were bundled up into a sack and left. Now that creates all kinds of problems in terms of how you study those remains, because you lose the vast majority of the context because you've removed them from their original positioning. But There are some really interesting kind of tones of mood music, and I have to be careful with what I say here, because a lot of this isn't public knowledge, but the discussions that are happening around what we call the planche noire bones is really interesting in terms of precedents that it may or may not set in terms of how we remember soldiers from this period going forwards. Sorry, apologies, that should have come with a trigger warning. Quite obviously, more human remains. This is not a sudden problem that's landed in front of us. These are the remains of 5 individuals who were found in Burgos in Spain during some municipal work in, I believe it was 2012. Actually, it might have been earlier than 2012, apologies. They were digging out an area in order to do some restoration work to a boundary, and they found, there's a debate about whether or not it's 5 or 6 individuals. I have my personal opinion on this. I personally think it's 5 individuals. I'll explain why in just a second. What you have here, so some basic analysis was done in terms of verifying ages where possible, because as you can see, some of these are partial skeletons, and so that's not always feasible. But look at the ages: 15 to 23, 22 to 24, 16 to 18. I'm conscious that we do have some people here tonight who are within those age ranges, but when you look at the lower ends, I mean, this person here, a child killed in conflict, we can probably narrow that individual down pretty finitely, because we know with a high degree of confidence that he was in the 58th Regiment because of the sort of when it was exhumed, they found buttons in precisely the locations where they would be if you were wearing a uniform of the 58th Regiment. So at the very least, when he was buried, he was wearing the uniform of the 58th, and uniforms weren't plentiful in Wellington's army during this particular campaign. So if he's wearing a 58th Regiment uniform, he was probably of the 58th Regiment. And then you can take that, look at the death registers for that particular campaign, and start to work out who fits the bill. You can also see causes of death. So number 3, shrapnel fragment to the head. Number 5, the bullet, in fact, was found inside the cranial cavity of that individual. What you have here is a really obvious indication of the horrors of war. Now, why do I say 5, not 6? Well, the right arm was found inverted but alongside number 5. We don't know why that might be the case. There are various potential reasons for that, but I'm not going to be gratuitously gory. I'll let you work that out for yourself. What this basically proves is that this is a problem that will keep cropping up. I've shown you 4 examples on the previous slide, and a 5th here. We know of others. It's been much less media attention, but there is a similar situation in Orthez in relation to remains from that battle. This is only going to get worse. As more and more work is being done on the American War of Independence battlefields, increasingly what is being found are more human remains. So a bunch of Hessians were found on one battlefield very recently. So what do we do about all of this? Well, there are no right or wrong answers. The NRWGC's stance is incredibly simple. We understand that there is an opportunity to learn about these people's experiences, to tell their stories through studying their remains. That's brilliant. That helps to further historical understanding. It helps to shine a greater light on what these people went through. You can look at things like their nutrition or lack of, based on various assessments of their bone. You can work out where these people grew up, what their social status was likely to be. You can do some incredible things with this. But at the end of that process, what happens? What do you do with these remains once you've learned everything you possibly can? There are a variety of opinions on this. One is that, well, why don't you keep samples of the bone, release the remainder for burial, and then you've got that sample and you can subsequently test it with any new fancy developments that happen in kind of technological and osteoarchaeological research in due course. Now that then raises the question of, are you just burying part of the body? And should you bury the whole body, or should you bury part of the body? And if you're only burying part of the body, are you doing the job properly? Again, a whole host of opinions on that with no definitive answer. The NRWGC stance is very simple. Learn everything you possibly can about them right here and now, and we'll pay for that. That's what we're set up to do as a charity. Then once you've learnt everything, we will supply exact copies of these remains. As I said, 3D printing means you can produce a resin cast that looks like the real thing. You wouldn't know the difference unless you physically handled them. You then give those to the museum or the institute that holds the remains so that they can use those for educational purposes at any point you want in the future. And then you bury them. And you bury them together in more or less the same way that they were found. And in doing so, you further the scope for people to remember. Because the whole point of why we look at these remains is to pause and reflect and think about what these individuals went through. So if you then bury them, you can create a place where people can go, a physical site of remembrance that doesn't currently exist. And again, the NRWGC would pay for the lot. Now, it's not just about disinterred remains. I am going to clarify this. I do not go around graveyards with like a whole social media team taking selfies of me, because, you know, taking selfies by graves is quite obviously, you know, quite problematic. I didn't even know that photo was being taken until I got sent it afterwards. And I know you'll all be going, yeah, sure, we all believe he's that. Genuinely, that's what happened. I was actually on the hunt with Hilda van der Kiel, who works on Time Team, for the grave of Sir Harry Barat in Lymington, and I didn't find it. We spent about 2 hours combing the cemetery. As you can see, in this particular instance, I'm trying to shine a light on a headstone that's severely wounded, severely eroded. And what I've noticed there is that there's a skull, which you might just be able to make out, that I was trying to see closer detail of. So that's what's happening there. I'm not vain, I promise. As we go through these, you're going to see some of the problems that we face as an organisation, because there is this basic point, right, that yes, there are individuals who die in conflict. The majority of them, though, make it back home. What happens to them then? Because this is a real opportunity. If we can identify where these veterans of the conflict lie, then we can bring the memory and the story of these individuals to you guys in your community, wherever you are in the world. It doesn't matter. So what you've got here is Lymington in Hampshire, Brompton Cemetery in London, again, Brompton Cemetery, different point being made there. Southampton Old Common Cemetery, and then this one is in York. So this is a photo that I took today. And that particular individual, Lieutenant George Al, who knows what the rest of that says, or when he died, or what unit he might have been. He's in St Mary's Abbey in York. So a nice little local example for you. But they all highlight some of the problems that we face. Burrards too, it's there somewhere. I can't find it for love nor money. George Buller was completely covered in grass, and this was installed really recently. So this is something like 2004, that a fresh ledger stone, which is a piece of stone laid flat in the ground, fresh ledger stone was put in for him. Clearly a very high profile instance because of the whole sharp fact in 95th Rifles, but his grave had been covered so completely by grass growth that I had to peel the grass back to uncover him, which actually initially meant I had to go poking around with a really tiny kind of gardening implement and try and work out where he was, which, as you can imagine, takes time, isn't a particularly nice thing to end up doing. This is the grave of James, let me get the name right, James Reginald Graham. There's a mouthful for you. He was in the 2nd Dragoons. As you can see, he's in the middle of a bramble thicket. Why? Because nobody's remembering these people and where they are and their significance in history. If you, however, start to maintain these sites, if you publicize these sites to the public, people can get involved. They can go there, they can remember, and we can make it far easier to go and see Buller and pay your respects, or go and see Graham and pay your respects. And by restoring and cleaning graves, you also avoid situations like this. At the weekend, I was in Southampton Old Cemetery on the hunt for veterans of the period. That's graffiti drawn by a child in chalk. I'm not entirely sure what the thought process was behind the parents taking chalk to a cemetery. In the adjacent tomb, the child had also started colouring in different parts of a much bigger grave in different colours of chalk, pink and yellow. Now, would that happen on a CWGC grave? Possibly, but probably not, because we know when we see a nicely maintained CWGC grave that there's that barrier. Now, to be clear, my personal stance is that that should happen on any grave, anywhere, at any point in time. Respect the dead, full stop. But if there was an understanding of that individual, and this is a significant individual, so this is it's not Harry Barrard. It is, apologies, Lieutenant General Richard Burnaby, Royal Artillery. He's a Waterloo veteran. He received the Waterloo Medal. His wife was actually the third daughter of Sir Alexander Dixon, who was one of the most prominent officers in the Portuguese artillery during the Peninsular War. We're talking a guy who married into serious circles, played a significant role in the history of the conflict. Does he deserve that? No. Does anybody deserve that? No. If you start to educate people about that, then you can avoid situations like that. What this all proves, though, is that effectively the NRWGC is 250 years too late to this problem. Which brings me to the bulk of who we are and what we do, and the physical demonstration of what we can achieve with time, with patience, with money, and with a hell of a lot of hard work. So our basic premise is to honour veterans of and casualties, obviously, of conflict from 1775 through to 1815, regardless of service record, regardless of nationality. None of that matters. If you can prove that this individual served their country, doesn't matter what that country is, doesn't matter why they signed up, they are covered by us. It is a monumental undertaking of headache-inducing proportions. Believe me, I have had many migraines over the scale of what we're trying to achieve here. We also make the point anywhere in the world. We are set up to work internationally. So American War of Independence, covered. The French Revolutionary Wars, covered. Those who died in colonial conflicts on both sides, covered. The Napoleonic Wars, covered. Those who died at sea, covered, although granted, almost all of them were buried at sea, so we don't have graves for them. And we work on three main premises: reinter, restore, and remember. Our three key aims as a charity are, when veterans are disinterred, we'll pay to get them reinterred. When it comes to graves, we want to try and turn these individuals' graves into sites of memory so that people can connect with their local individuals who served in this period. Which means that we then go and clean graves like the one that you can see on the right-hand side. This is the grave of Walter Burke. Some of you might not have heard of him, but he was quite significant. At the time of the Battle of Trafalgar, he was the oldest purser in the entire Royal Navy. He was aboard HMS Victory during the battle, and when Nelson was wounded, he held Nelson in his arms as the Admiral died. You don't get much closer to the centre of a major event in history than that. This was his grave until late last year. We had the grave restored prior to the Trafalgar anniversary because every year, such is the reverence with which Burke is held within the community in Woodham where he was buried, that the local primary school en masse come and lay flowers at his grave. Now, as you can see from the photo on the left-hand side, they might come and see his grave, but they can't really read what it says. So we did something about that. We had it cleaned. And for the first time in a generation, those school children were able to read the inscription on Burke's grave as they laid the flowers. They were able to connect in a far more immediate, far more tangible way with the man and his life and his significance than most of those who had been before them. Now, how do we achieve all of this? Well, here's the rather shameless plug. It's through membership and donations and all the rest of it. I will keep this brief, but essentially £25 a year. If you're interested in joining us, please do. There are flyers around. If not, if you can't get to a flyer, come and see me afterwards and I'll give you the details. What do you get for that? Well, partly you're making this happen. Something like this, basically, that would cost in the region of £250 to £300 to do a much more significant restoration can cost thousands. So for example, to sort out Beresford will cost us something like £2,000 because you've got to deconstruct the grave, solve the issues internally, and then put it back together. For that, you also get access to monthly talks for free, discounts at publishers, all the rest of it. If you would like more details on that, please drop me a line. So, as I start to wrap up this talk, let's tackle some of the counter arguments. One really interesting point was made by Stu Eve, who's an archaeologist, who lives quite near me actually on the south coast. He asked, if you clean a tombstone, are you degrading the history of that stone? That's a really interesting comment. And it's a comment that's kind of, the answer to which kind of lies in this image here. This is a picture from Brompton Cemetery. So what some of you might not be familiar with is that not all individuals who fell during the First and Second World Wars are buried in CWGC cemeteries. Some of them are buried in family plots, and then as the graves themselves deteriorate, families have the option to hand the grave over to CWGC care, and they pay for the maintenance of the grave. Is that a warning on time? No. Okay, lovely. I'll continue to waffle on then until somebody heckles me. What this kind of emphasizes, therefore, is the contrast, the dichotomy, that we've got three broken graves, all in a line, and one of them gets remembered because of the guy's service. Now, you might find that deeply problematic. It's something that I look at and struggle with personally. Obviously, you can't maintain every single tombstone everywhere around the world. But it's important for us to remember what is the purpose of a tombstone. The tombstone is there as a marker of that individual's life, the last, ideally semi-permanent commemoration of that individual. If you can't read the tombstone anymore, is it serving that purpose? Are we applying modern attitudes to an old problem? Honestly, yes, absolutely we are. And I'll tell you why we're doing that. When the dead from Waterloo were buried, when the dead from the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig were buried, they were put in mass graves, mass burial pits that were unmarked. About 20 years later, those graves were plundered for the bones. The reason? There was a trade across Europe, but particularly in the UK, that used ground bone as a form of fertilizer. And some research by Tony Pollard has suggested that they may even have been used as a supplement to sugar. So quite clearly, we are taking a modern stance on commemoration of the war dead and applying it to a conflict and a time in which people didn't have that level of thought process. But there's plenty from history that we look at and go, actually, you know what, that wasn't right. Perhaps when it comes to commemoration of the war dead, this is another point where we look back on history and think there's a better way, and perhaps we can start to do something about that. Is it an impossible task? Yes. I will be in the ground before the work of this charity is done. And much though I might look like I'm 12 years old, trust me, I'm not. It is, I said earlier, it's a headache-inducing task. In 1813, the British Army alone comprised of 250,000 people. Think about Napoleon's Grande Armée that goes into Russia in 1812. All told, when you include reinforcements, 650,000 people, of which 90% became casualties. Yes, this is a vast task. People have turned around to me and said, focus on one country. And my response is quite emphatic. No, because one country doesn't matter more than another. Just because somebody served France doesn't mean that they're less worthy of remembrance than somebody who served in Britain or Austria or Spain or whatever country you might choose to pick. So yes, it's impossible, but that doesn't mean that we can't start somewhere, start to make a difference, and start to kind of lay those foundations for something more permanent in terms of how we remember sacrifice during this period. There is also this question that I've emphasized a lot. Where do you draw the line? I don't know. Nobody's got an answer for that. Nobody's got an answer for any of these issues. That's part of the reason that we're here tonight having this conversation, so that we can start to move towards some kind of consensus. And on that point, I just want to make an exclusive announcement, and apologies to Graham, because I didn't warn you that this was happening, which was really bad planning on my part. But at the NRWGC, we've been grappling with this problem for a year. You've got a two-pronged problem here. The first is that you don't know who was in the army in the first place, the various armies, to then be able to turn around when you look at a headstone and say, yes, that individual is eligible for charity support or not. At the same time, you don't know where those people were buried. And as you've seen with some of the examples, in many cases, tombstones are so severely eroded that you can't see who is buried there. How do you solve that? There's only one answer to that. You do it the hard way with a heck of a lot of research. And that is why the NRWGC is launching the Rediscovering the War Dead project. This is going to be a multi-year and many-year-long effort involving volunteers who will drive this program of research forward under the guidance of experts from across the historical community. The basic vision here is to reconnect the public with their local veterans. We are asking volunteers to go into archives and start to comb through the burial registers that exist across countries around the world to start to produce lists of who is buried in a particular plot, so that then when people go into a graveyard, they are not stumbling blindly for hours on end, peering at headstones, getting absolutely nowhere, and getting quite wet and cold in the process. If you have the information, if you go into a graveyard forearmed, you can start to narrow down the research time. You can produce results much faster, which is much more rewarding. But you also have to tackle the problem from the other end. So you also need to know who was it, who served, because sometimes you get somebody who might be described as lieutenant. So I'll use an example that's local to me. So there's a Captain Thomas Toogood, who is buried in Southampton, and he was born in 1800 and he died in, I believe it was 86. His years of life mean that he might have signed up in the very latter stages of the Napoleonic era. He also might not have. But until you start to go into the service records and start to comprehensively go through and tabulate who served and when, you can't start to work out who is within the charity's remit and who isn't. So with that two-pronged attack, if you like, on this problem, the idea is that the two will meet in the middle. And what the charity will do is release all of this information for free to the public year by year. So our early focus is going to be on those who served in 1775. We are currently in discussions, and I have to emphasize those are discussions, with the American Battlefields Trust and the National Army Museum about a much bigger collaborative project starting on the American War of Independence to start to drive this process forward. Once we have information about who is buried where and who served, and again, as with the charity's focuses, this will be regardless of nationality, regardless of service, regardless of how long they served, and regardless of why they left the service. We will put all of that information together into a fully searchable database and interactive map so that you can go online on your phone and you can narrow down where that individual is buried to a 3 square meter plot anywhere in the world. That is the vision. It will take a heck of a long time. If you are interested in potentially working with us on that, and again, this is a shameless plug and an ad, apologies, but it's part of what I'm here to do as chair. Please get in touch with us. Our details are at the bottom of the screen. Email contact.nrwgc@gmail.com, and our brilliant volunteers coordinator, Megan Kelleher, will get in touch with you with further details. So that brings me to the end of this talk. I want to thank you all for your very kind attention this evening. I've emphasized time and time again, there are no clear solutions to these problems. There are only a myriad more problems. You apply one solution, that opens up further questions. The single most important thing that I would like people to take away from this is that how you respond to this, first of all, is personal to you. And whatever that response is, that's totally fine. If you think this is a waste of time, I respect that. If you also think that we're mad for even attempting this, I totally respect that. Because we are totally mad for attempting this, if I'm being brutally honest. But it's important to bear in mind that commemoration and remembrance is a personal thing, and nothing emphasizes that better than this. I was in Brompton Cemetery just last week and came across this plaque in the Chelsea Pensioners Burial Ground in Brompton Cemetery. Now, if you've ever been to that burial ground, it is so many of the stones have eroded that effectively it's now been turned into a meadow. But clearly, whoever is the great grandson or granddaughter of Samson Webb wasn't happy about the fact that when they visited that particular plot in Brompton Cemetery, there was nothing to remember their ancestor. There are all kinds of solutions to this problem. That is just one of them. How we find a way forward, how we build a consensus is down to us as a society. As I said at the start, we have moved on from grand narratives. We have moved on from focusing on the people at the top to the people who really matter to us, the people like us. Can we remember them? Will we remember them? Well, only time will tell. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zach, for really compelling talk there. Some really interesting stuff. Really thought-provoking. A lot of applause floating up the screen as we speak. Zach has, well, I'd say kindly agreed to take questions. I didn't actually ask him. Zach is taking questions. So, start in the room. Anyone got any questions for Zach to kick us off?
Can we run off to the pub? It's usually a popular question.
Yeah, in 10 minutes.
Is there any future plans in any sort of like scientific group? So something that could be preserved in a respectful way, but if needs be, we get the scientific facts needed to correctly identify these bones. That it's horrible setting words, like dig up a grave, but something that we can actually correctly identify this body, say from a Waterloo gravesite, and know who this person is now. Is that probably, obviously we can't speak for the entire but is that kind of in line with this idea of preservation?
What's really interesting when it comes to human remains is the first conversation we always have is what about DNA? And we've spoken to a lot of experts on this, as you can imagine. The consensus is always, it doesn't matter if you get DNA, you can never be 100%. And so as an organization, we wrestled with this in our foundation stages and basically said, what's the worst that can happen here? And the worst that can happen is you get it wrong and you put the wrong name on somebody's headstone. As you can imagine, that is as disrespectful as, probably more disrespectful than not putting them in the ground in the first place. So as an organization, we've always said, if DNA can't help us, there isn't the sense of spending the money on doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't try and trace descendants. So we always look, and we're doing that right now. So for those of you who are familiar with your Royal Engineers from this period, you might know of Lieutenant General and later Field Marshal Sir John Fox Burgoyne. His family plot, he's actually buried in the Tower of London, but his family plot is in Brompton Cemetery. It has a crack running across about a quarter of it that will spread with time. We're trying to very urgently get work done to get that sorted. How do you do that? Well, one of the things you have to do, if you can, is connect with local families and reach out. So I'm currently emailing and trying to get hold of a member of the House of Lords to try and get them to respond to say, yes, you can do the work on that grave. That doesn't answer specifically your question though, which is, what about advancements in time? That's always a big question. All we can work on is what we have here and now. I think we can probably quite confidently say that once somebody is in the ground, that will probably be it. So this is why, as an organization, we basically put the emphasis and the responsibility with the museum and say, look, this is the service we offer. Would you like to take us up on it? And they can stipulate anything that they like. If they want DNA analysis, we'll pay for DNA analysis. We'll make it happen if they think that's going to help them. But once we've learned everything we possibly can, our philosophy is there's nothing more we can learn right now. How much benefit do we gain by sitting here and waiting for some technological development that may or may not come in the future? I appreciate that's not a perfect answer to the solution, but that's how I'll start as a charity.
Questions?
In terms of bones found at Waterloo, did two brothers put together an ossuary at Napoleonic Examples? And museum there started displaying the skeletons since 2015.
There isn't a skeleton, so the Memorial 1815 Museum displays the skeleton. That's the photo that you saw earlier. I won't flick back to it. The ossuary is a separate thing. So that is in La Dernière-Coitiers, which is just to the south of the Waterloo battlefield. As you say, it's the place that Napoleon stayed the night before Waterloo. Yes, there is an ossuary there. It's a brick shack, effectively, it has a door in it, but there's a sort of a metal grille over the door and it's open to the elements. And what is contained within that are bones that are dug up as a result of farming. It's still an active working landscape. If you go there at particular points of the year, you still see the corn of the Waterloo battlefield because they sow it year on year. In September, there are turnips. Don't ask me how I know that, I just do. So yes, one of the things that we also have to bear in mind here, and this is a really interesting but important point, is that there are cultural differences. So culturally, the idea of catacombs being open to the public and ossuaries is far more commonplace in France and Belgium than it is here in the UK. And we have to respect those cultural differences. So yes, it's there. What you do about those remains is an unending, open-ended question. You could do the analysis, but once some remains are dug up from farming, you lose a lot of the context to studying them. And it seems fairly clear to me at the moment that there isn't a lot of appetite to do much in terms of changing the way in which those remains are on display in the ossuary.
The local community will certainly take care of it. But in the actual museum itself, we've got a display of a skeleton, different to the one found at the New Waterloo Museum.
Not as far as I'm aware, and I was filming out there in June and then was out there again in August of last year.
This
So
was our last visit there, so basically 4 years ago.
okay,
Photographs. Good play to use a camera.
interesting, because I was there in 2019, September 2019. I didn't see that. Perhaps I just missed it.
This might link slightly to Rachel's question on the chat there as well, so we'll jump straight in with that. I wonder what the role of cultural context is here. In many cultures, the display of human remains, even if they're recently deceased, are displayed for purposes of remembrance and honour. Are reservations about human remains therefore overly influenced by our Anglo-centric approach?
Yeah, this is really important, and as you say, it chimes into what I said, that we have to respect cultural differences and cultural sensitivities to this. Some cultures cremate their dead, and so there are no remains to recover. Yes, it is certainly the case that we look at this with a degree of Anglo-centricism, but I would also go back to what I said, or at least Western hemispherical centricism, if that's even a word. But I would go back to what I said in relation to World War I and World War II. If they're veterans from that conflict, i.e. they died in a war which we deem it to be appropriate, we do all of the things that the NRWGC seeks to facilitate for an earlier conflict. So it comes back to this ongoing conflict of why do we do it for one war and not for others?
We're just sort of leading on from that one, back to the talk of that. And sort of leading on from that, I conference a couple of months ago and we had a presentation from Siobhan Doyle, one of the curators of the National Museum of Art, Paul Barrett, and the discussion was there about the presentation of Michael Collins's not his remains necessarily, the Irish Charter Land, so there was one point his hat with his brain matter still on it, his coat is still will be the next day. I'm curious about, in terms of looking museum work, looking at the museum there, is there much thought to, I guess, the sense of not quite martyrdom, but particularly looking at the Western centricism, the opposite side, whatever that is. So looking at this idea again, focusing on what they're our war dead. Do we have more of a vested interest, or do we have a vested stake in maintaining them as a burial site rather than necessarily treating them in a sense that culture is appreciated as well? I guess I'm sort of curious to hear whether there's a discussion about how commemoration is done in a museum sense, and whether the NRWGC is going to have much respect and input on that at that point, particularly looking at the need for
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we have our preferences, and those preferences are pretty obvious as a war grave charity. Commemoration first. Where possible, we prefer burial, but we'll pay whatever it takes, because we'll fundraise for it, to make that option viable for museums. But there's also, as I emphasised earlier, a fundamental respect that we're all professionals in this game. This is why the Board of Trustees consists of museum curators, archaeologists, osteoarchaeologists, historians, and individuals from across the world as well. We're an international organisation deliberately built in a way that means we have a multitude of cultural perspectives on this issue. Now, what does that mean in terms of how museums might approach us? Well, our stance is all we can do is ask, and if they say no, we respect that, because ultimately each institution has responsibility for the custody of its own collection. And fundamentally, if it's in an institution and it's a set of human remains, they are still part of that collection. We can make the arguments. If they don't want to hear those arguments, then fine. We understand that, we respect that. We then move on to the next project or the next individual on the list, and we take it from there. How much is going to change over time? I don't know. This is why I put up the Lonely Planet comment, because I found that really interesting, this concept of remains for entertainment. And that's not unique to the Lonely Planet. There are museums in York, in fact, where you can carry out excavation on a fake human remain. So there is this open-ended question about where is that line? And nobody's got an answer for that. Nobody's ever probably going to have an answer for that unless there's a big legal case. But our stance isn't to start trying to throw some kind of book or moral argument at organisations. It's just, what do you think is right? We have this perspective. This is an option for you. If you want to take it, great. We're here to help.
Right.
I think it was a really interesting topic that you talked about, like drawing the line as well between the length of time, especially in consideration of the First World War. How much do you think its effect of time, sort of closeness to us in terms of relatives, in comparison to maybe the importance around the time of photography and videos, and how maybe that connection of death and actually seeing it visualized means that we will always have close connections like first and second.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you for that. Firstly, just a thing that I always find slightly odd to get my head around as somebody born in the 90s. We are now in a position where those who died in 1914 are further away from us historically than those who died in 1815 were to those who died in 1914. It's a 99-year gap between 1815 to 1914, and now we're on, 109 years from the start of the First World War, which again raises this question about where does this boundary lie, and we don't have an answer for it. It's also interesting that we are now in a situation where that 100-year rule, that is more of a kind of convention, but nonetheless is applied, shouldn't technically apply to soldiers who died in the First World War, but quite obviously it does, and we all understand the reasons for that. Yes, I think there is that kind of greater sense of cultural immediacy when it comes to the First and Second World War. It is far more taught in our schools. It is a far greater focus of popular writing. It's far more prominent in memory when it comes to documentaries. You walk into a bookshop and look at the history section, and probably 50% of that bookshop's history section will be military history, and about 2/3 of that will probably be 20th century conflict. So it is far more deeply ingrained in popular psyche. Also bear in mind, we don't teach the Napoleonic era really much in secondary school anymore, and I say that as an ex-teacher. But yes, the imagery thing is really curious, because we have plenty of images for officers, and we have some very visceral paintings from this period, but we don't have, as you say, photographs. Well, we have a photograph of Wellington and a couple of others, but that's because he lived long enough to be photographed. I guess it probably needs somebody who's a better expert on the significance of photography on popular memory to answer exactly what you're asking. But I think it's definitely a factor. amongst other factors. Yeah, sorry, that's probably not the best answer, but there we go.
The questions in the room, a couple more on the chat. Any others? Oh, geez. This way, don't put me anywhere near technology. First of all, Zach, the question at the top there, you've kind of alluded to this already, but what do you think about identification of soldiers killed in action during the Napoleonic Wars? Is it possible, and what are the must-haves to identify?
Must-haves. I mean, it's kind of a bad analogy to ask what is the smoking gun, I guess, in this case. DNA can only get you so far. Ideally, you want an artifact that that gives you a clear indication of who the individual is. Now, it's very rare to get that artifact from those who die in this period, partly because the dead get robbed as soon as they die, because they've got stuff on. If you've got coins in their pocket, the next soldier in the line is going to help themselves to that because it's not much use to the soldier anymore. So it's very rare that you get personal effects, and this was part of the reason that the soldier found on what is now Memorial 1815 was so unusual, because it actually died probably en route to a casualty clearing station, for want of a better term, and collapsed on the way and probably died alone. He clearly wasn't noticed, and that's why Gareth, when he was doing this research, was able to use the fact that there are two initials inscribed on a pouch that he had on him, and then extrapolate from that and start to look at relevant records based on age and other enlistment data for the unit that he was a part of. So you need something like that to try and help. Even then, being 100% sure is just not going to happen.
Anybody in the room, or should we take the next couple there?
What about religion? Would that be a factor in determining
If we can identify their faith, then yes, absolutely. This is part of the reason that we would always want to do analysis of the remains to try and work out their origin. You know, you can do plenty of analysis to work out where somebody grew up, which gives you a very good indicator. You do things like strontium and isotope analysis and oxygen and even nitrogen isotope analysis, and you can start to put all those together, because the different isotopes vary depending on different regions of the world. And from that, you can then start to work out where somebody grew up. Now, if you can work out where somebody grew up, you get a better indication of what they may have been inclined to believe. You still can't be emphatic, so you still have to be incredibly careful. So from our perspective, it kind of goes back to this idea earlier. The worst thing you can do is get it wrong. So how do you solve that? You craft a ceremony that is probably closest to the kind of ceremony that they would have received from their relevant army at that point in time, because of course there is a process within there that each army has its own style of service, and you can use that as a basis from which to work.
British Army enlistment asks for religion, other nationalities, and then ask the same question.
That's a really good point, actually, which I hadn't considered. So enlistment information may help us, but of course, for the British, there is a point at which you're not allowed to be Catholic if you're in the army. So white lies and all of that might be a problem there as well. Yeah, absolutely.
A couple more in here. How do you deal with the inherent bias towards reinforcing commemoration of marked graves and the relative inaccessibility of the many veterans' casualties who are likely buried at unmarked graves?
Yeah, it's a massive problem. The biggest frustration I have time and time again is that the ones that I go out and find are almost exclusively officer burials. I think I've done 3 or 4 NCOs out of about 50 that I've identified and assessed, which gives you that indication of the disparity, because let's remember that 90% of an army is its rank and file. Part of the way that we do that is, of course, with things like the database, because we're not being exclusive in terms of looking at officers. in that database, we are covering all ranks. So it does give us the ability to tell that story. Where we find rank and file graves, hey, great. The fact that they are rank and file graves means that they're of particular interest to us because of that benefit in terms of highlighting the experience of a group that tends to be pushed to the sideline when it comes to this story. But as with so much of this, there isn't a perfect answer.
I'll just, that's the last one in there as well. Essentially, academics aren't always in tune with culture at large. So how do we make sure that your charity or that this charity is reflecting culture at large? And how do we deal with that as intellectuals? The question is.
It's a brilliant question. It comes back to what I said in that final slide. Talk to us. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to veterans. Talking to veterans is always really interesting because they're the ones who probably feel this the most strongly. They feel that kind of personal affinity to this, and the modern attitudes of the army don't seem to stop as you go further back in time. You know, they feel that these people who served are effectively their martial ancestors, and so they feel really strongly about this. And in fact, one of the guys that we hire, a guy called Steve Davis, is an ex-veteran. He goes by the name Military Grave Restorer. He's made it his life's work in retirement to go around cleaning up these graves so that people do remember those individuals. All we can do is things like this. We have that conversation and we try and work out what the consensus is to then work out an appropriate way forward. You've got to bear in mind that the foundation stone of this charity is remembrance and commemoration. That won't change. That doesn't mean that the charity won't adapt over the course of time to produce methods of commemoration that are more appropriate. And you can see that with the volunteer program that we're launching, where it gives people the choice in terms of where they go, who they choose to remember, and how they start to access that information.
We've got about 2 minutes left if anyone's got another question. There's several, but I'm not going to inflict them on you because you've probably got lives to lead, places to go, dinner to eat. Anyone got any more questions in the room or online? In which case, it just remains for us to thank Zack for a fascinating talk and for answering our questions as well. Thank you very much.